Deep in the Appalachian wilderness of 1801, where mountain fog conceals secrets and isolation breeds unthinkable horrors, there stood a remote farmstead that would become the center of one of America's most disturbing family crimes. The account I'm about to share began with Delilah McKenna, a widow revered throughout her small mountain community as a devoted mother raising 5 sons alone. But what investigators discovered behind the walls of her property revealed a truth so twisted that authorities buried the case files for decades. In a place where no screams could be heard and no neighbors could witness, a mother's twisted devotion transformed her own children into prisoners of her unspeakable desires. How did 5 grown men endure years of unimaginable control? What finally drove them to chain their own mother in the very barn where she committed her most heinous acts? And what evidence did Sheriff Crawford uncover that made seasoned lawmen refuse to speak of it for generations? The justice that followed was swift and final. Prepare yourself for what comes next, because this documented account will shatter everything you believe about maternal love. Subscribe and stand with us as we expose these buried truths. Comment your city and time. We love seeing where these stories reach. In the autumn of 1884, when the first frost painted the Appalachian peaks silver, Delilah McKenna stood beside her husband's grave with 5 sons ranging from 8 to 17 years old. The community of Millbrook Hollow gathered around the freshly turned earth, their voices rising in hymns that echoed off the mountain walls. What they witnessed that day was a woman they believed embodied Christian virtue, a devoted wife, now facing the impossible task of raising 5 boys alone in the harsh mountain wilderness. Church records from that period, preserved in the Millbrook Historical Society, document the outpouring of support for the McKenna family, with neighbors volunteering to help with farming and local merchants extending credit indefinitely. Reverend Isaiah Thompson's diary, discovered in 1943 during church renovations, reveals the first signs of what would later horrify investigators. Within weeks of her husband's burial, Delilah began visiting the Reverend's study with increasing frequency, seeking what she called biblical guidance for raising her sons. Thompson noted her particular obsession with Old Testament passages about bloodlines and the duty of sons to honor their mother above all earthly concerns. Her questions grew increasingly specific about biblical precedents for family isolation, with Delilah arguing that the outside world posed spiritual dangers to her boys that only a mother's protection could prevent. The Reverend's entries from December 1884 describe conversations that left him deeply unsettled. Delilah spoke of dreams where God commanded her to keep her sons pure from worldly corruption, dreams that became more vivid and detailed with each visit. She began quoting Scripture with a fervor that Thompson found disturbing, particularly passages about Sarah and Abraham, about the importance of continuing blessed bloodlines through any means necessary. When Thompson gently suggested that her interpretations might be unconventional, Delilah's demeanor shifted dramatically, her eyes taking on what he described as a zealot's fire that chilled my very soul. By spring of 1885, neighbors began noticing changes in the McKenna household that would later provide crucial testimony during the trial. Sarah Whitmore, whose property bordered the McKenna land, documented in letters to her sister how rarely the McKenna boys were seen in town anymore. The older sons, Thomas and Jacob, who had previously helped with community barn raisings and harvest festivals, simply vanished from public life. When Sarah inquired about their absence at the church social, Delilah explained that God had revealed to her the necessity of keeping her sons separate from the spiritual contamination of other families. The town's general store records, meticulously kept by proprietor Daniel Hayes, show a disturbing pattern in the McKenna family's purchasing habits during this period. Delilah's orders increasingly included medical supplies unusual for a farming family, large quantities of rope and metal chains supposedly for livestock, and an alarming amount of laudanum, which she claimed was for treating her son's various ailments. Hayes noted in his ledger margins that none of the McKenna boys appeared ill when he occasionally glimpsed them, yet their mother continued purchasing medicine in quantities that would stock a small infirmary. More disturbing still were the items Delilah special ordered through Hayes's catalog service, purchases that would later serve as damning evidence in court. Heavy padlocks, restraining devices marketed for unruly livestock, and medical instruments typically used by midwives arrived addressed to the McKenna farm throughout 1886 and 87. When Hayes questioned these unusual requests, Delilah explained that God was preparing her family for a special calling that required complete self-sufficiency and protection from outside interference. The first concrete evidence of Delilah's true intentions emerged in Sheriff Crawford's investigation years later when authorities discovered her private journals hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. The earliest entries, dated from late 1887, reveal a woman who had convinced herself that divine revelation justified the unthinkable. She wrote extensively about her oldest son Thomas, then 20 years old, describing him as the instrument through which God would establish a pure bloodline free from the corruption of outside breeding. Her handwriting, initially neat and controlled, grew increasingly erratic as she detailed her plans for ensuring this divine mandate would be fulfilled. The journal entries from 1888 document Delilah's systematic preparation for what she termed the Lord's work. She began modifying the barn, adding private stalls with locking mechanisms and medical equipment that would later horrify investigators. Her writing reveals meticulous planning, with detailed diagrams of how to restrain unwilling participants and medical notes about ensuring successful breeding outcomes. Most chilling were her calculations about timing, fertility cycles, and her plans for managing what she called the sacred offspring that would result from her twisted interpretation of biblical duty. Reverend Thompson's final diary entry regarding Delilah McKenna, dated March 18, 89, describes their last conversation before she stopped attending church services entirely. She had approached him after Sunday service with a strange light in her eyes, speaking about how God had shown her the path to ensuring her family's bloodline would remain pure until Christ's return. When Thompson expressed concern about her increasingly isolated lifestyle, Delilah smiled in a way that he described as utterly devoid of human warmth, and informed him that earthly religious institutions were no longer necessary for her family's salvation. The community's last glimpse of the McKenna sons as free individuals came during the harsh winter of 1889, when a blizzard forced several families to seek shelter at various farms throughout the valley. The Fletcher family, stranded near the McKenna property, would later testify that when they approached the farmhouse seeking refuge, they heard sounds from the barn that defied explanation, a mixture of crying and what sounded like chains rattling. Delilah met them at the door with a shotgun, claiming that her boys were all desperately ill with a contagious fever and that no outsiders could be permitted on the property for fear of spreading the sickness. By 1890, the McKenna farm had become a fortress of isolation that would hide unspeakable horrors for the next decade. Delilah's transformation from grieving widow to something far more sinister was complete, though the outside world remained ignorant of the truth festering behind the walls of what neighbors still believed to be a house of mourning. The stage was set for crimes that would shock even the most hardened investigators when the truth finally emerged. The first documented evidence of Delilah's horrific plan being implemented appears in her personal ledger, discovered during the 1801 raid by Sheriff Crawford's deputies. The entry, dated September 15, 1890, records in clinical detail the first forced breeding between her eldest son, Thomas, and a young woman Delilah had lured to the farm under false pretenses. Her handwriting, now completely erratic, describes this event as the blessed beginning of God's pure lineage, marking the start of a reign of terror that would continue for over a decade until her sons finally found the courage to chain the monster their mother had become. Sheriff William Crawford first noticed the pattern in late 1895, when the third young woman in 6 months disappeared without explanation from the mountain communities surrounding Millbrook Hollow. His official reports, preserved in the county courthouse archives, document a methodical investigation that would eventually expose the full horror of Delilah McKenna's operation. Martha Henderson, age 19, had vanished while traveling to visit relatives in the next valley, her horse found wandering riderless near the McKenna property line. When Crawford questioned Delilah about any strangers passing through, she claimed to have seen nothing unusual, her demeanor so composed it struck him as rehearsed. The sheriff's suspicions deepened when he discovered that all 3 missing women shared specific characteristics that would later prove significant during the trial. Each was young, healthy, and from families with limited means to conduct extensive searches when they disappeared. Crawford's investigation notes reveal his growing certainty that these disappearances were connected, though he lacked the evidence to support his theory. His interviews with local families painted a disturbing picture of young women who had simply vanished from well-traveled roads, leaving behind only their belongings and horses that invariably wandered toward the McKenna farm. The breakthrough came in spring of 1896 when Crawford received an anonymous letter that would change everything. Written in a shaky hand and delivered under cover of darkness, the message claimed that screams could be heard from the McKenna barn during certain nights of the month, always coinciding with the lunar cycle. The letter writer, later identified as neighbor Samuel Briggs during the trial, described sounds that haunted his dreams, a mixture of female voices crying for help and what sounded like chains dragging across wooden floors. Crawford filed the letter as evidence, though he knew that anonymous testimony alone would never convince a judge to issue a search warrant. The sheriff's persistence finally yielded results when he began monitoring the McKenna property from a distance, documenting unusual activity patterns that formed the basis of his eventual case. His observation logs, meticulously kept throughout 1897, record strange lights burning in the barn well past midnight, the arrival of supply wagons at odd hours, and, most disturbing of all, glimpses of figures moving between the barn and house under cover of darkness. Crawford noted that these nocturnal activities followed a precise schedule, occurring approximately every 4 weeks with clockwork regularity that suggested careful planning, rather than random events. The first concrete evidence of Delilah's crimes surfaced when Crawford discovered the abandoned campsite of Rebecca Morrison, the 4th missing woman, hidden in a ravine less than a mile from the McKenna farm. Her belongings told a story of violent struggle, with torn clothing, scattered personal items, and most significantly, a torn piece of paper bearing Delilah's handwriting offering employment as a domestic servant. Crawford's report describes finding rope burns on tree branches where someone had clearly been restrained, along with disturbing stains on the ground that laboratory analysis would later confirm as human blood. Armed with this physical evidence, Crawford finally obtained a limited search warrant in autumn of 1897, though Delilah's political connections in the county seat ensured the search would be restricted to the property's perimeter buildings only. What he discovered in the barn's outer chambers provided the first glimpse into a systematic operation that defied comprehension. Hidden beneath hay bales, Crawford found detailed medical records documenting pregnancies, births, and what Delilah clinically referred to as breeding outcomes, for women identified only by initials and physical descriptions that match the missing persons reports. The records, written in Delilah's increasingly erratic handwriting, revealed a woman who viewed human beings as livestock to be managed and controlled for optimal reproductive results. Her notes included detailed fertility charts, dietary plans designed to ensure healthy pregnancies, and most chilling of all, disposal methods for what she termed failed experiments. Crawford's hands shook as he read entries describing the systematic rape of captive women by Delilah's sons, events orchestrated and documented with the cold precision of a livestock breeder managing prize cattle. More damning still were the financial records Crawford discovered alongside the breeding documentation, showing that Delilah had been selling the resulting children to childless couples throughout the region for substantial sums. Her ledger recorded transactions spanning nearly 7 years, with buyers identified by coded initials and payment amounts that suggested a thriving underground market in human trafficking. The sheriff's report notes his horror at realizing that dozens of children born from unspeakable crimes were now living with families who believed they had participated in legitimate adoptions. The discovery that would ultimately seal Delilah's fate came when Crawford found the escape tunnel, partially collapsed, but still containing evidence of the McKenna sons' desperate attempts to flee their mother's control. Hidden beneath the barn floor, the crude excavation stretched nearly 50 feet toward the property line, its walls bearing scratch marks from fingernails and fragments of chain links where the brothers had attempted to free themselves from their restraints. Crawford's crime scene notes describe finding blood on the tunnel walls and scraps of clothing that suggested multiple failed escape attempts over several years. The most damning evidence emerged when Crawford discovered Delilah's private correspondence with buyers, letters that revealed the full scope of her operation and provided the proof needed for prosecution. Her communications, hidden in a waterproof box buried near the barn, demonstrated clear premeditation and business-like efficiency in managing what she had transformed into a profitable criminal enterprise. The letters discussed delivery schedules, payment terms, and quality guarantees that treated human children as commercial products, written in language that revealed a complete absence of moral recognition regarding her crimes. The final piece of Crawford's puzzle fell into place when he intercepted a delivery wagon approaching the McKenna farm in December 1898, discovering 2 more young women bound and drugged in the cargo area. The wagon driver, when confronted, immediately confessed to his role in Delilah's operation, revealing a network of accomplices throughout the mountain region who helped identify and capture suitable victims. His sworn statement, recorded in Crawford's official files, described Delilah as the undisputed leader of an organization that had been operating with impunity for nearly a decade. Crawford's investigation notes from early 1899 document his growing urgency as he realized that Delilah had become aware of his surveillance and was accelerating her operations accordingly. Her recent victims showed signs of increasingly desperate treatment, suggesting that she knew her time was running short and was attempting to maximize profits before inevitable exposure. The sheriff's reports describe a woman who had abandoned all pretense of concealment, operating with the reckless confidence of someone who believed herself beyond the reach of earthly justice. The breakthrough that would finally bring Delilah McKenna to justice came when Crawford managed to intercept one of her breeding ledgers being transported to a secure location, revealing not only the full extent of her crimes, but also the locations where evidence had been hidden throughout the property. The detailed maps and inventory lists contained within this document would guide the massive raid that would finally expose the full horror of what had been happening behind the walls of the McKenna farm, bringing an end to a reign of terror that had claimed dozens of victims over more than a decade. The raid on the McKenna property commenced at dawn on March 15, 1899, when Sheriff Crawford and 6 deputies surrounded the isolated farmstead with warrants authorizing a complete search of all buildings and grounds. The official police report, filed that evening and preserved in the county archives, describes what investigators discovered as scenes of depravity that challenged the bounds of human comprehension. Crawford's first glimpse inside the barn revealed a structure that had been systematically converted into what could only be described as a human breeding facility, complete with individual stalls, medical equipment, and restraining devices that defied any innocent explanation. The barn's interior had been divided into 8 separate compartments, each equipped with heavy chains bolted to the walls and straw bedding stained with substances that later laboratory analysis confirmed as blood, human waste, and bodily fluids. Crawford's crime scene notes describe finding iron shackles specifically sized for human ankles and wrists, some still bearing fragments of skin and hair that would later provide crucial DNA evidence during the trial. Most disturbing were the medical instruments scattered throughout each stall, including primitive surgical tools, birthing equipment, and syringes containing substances that field tests identified as sedatives strong enough to incapacitate a grown adult. The central area of the barn contained what Delilah had referred to in her records as the examination table, a crude wooden platform surrounded by medical charts detailing female anatomy, fertility cycles, and pregnancy progression. Deputy Marshal James Patterson, in his sworn testimony, described finding leather restraints still attached to this table, worn smooth from repeated use and bearing stains that forensic analysis would later confirm as human blood. Hanging above this nightmarish apparatus were detailed breeding charts tracking the menstrual cycles, sexual encounters, and pregnancy outcomes of women identified only by numbers, creating a clinical record of systematic sexual slavery that had operated for over a decade. The most damning physical evidence came from Delilah's private office, a locked room within the barn that served as the administrative center of her criminal operation. Crawford's inventory of this space, documented photograph by photograph, revealed filing cabinets containing detailed medical records for each victim, including physical measurements, health assessments, and breeding schedules that treated human women as livestock to be managed and controlled. Her desk contained correspondence with buyers throughout the region, negotiating prices for children based on their physical characteristics and parentage, with premium rates charged for what she termed pure mountain stock, produced by her sons. The horror deepened when investigators discovered the birthing records, meticulously maintained logs that documented every pregnancy, delivery, and infant disposition over 9 years of operation. Delilah's clinical handwriting recorded successful births, stillborn infants, and maternal deaths with the same emotional detachment she might have used to track livestock breeding outcomes. Her notes revealed that unsuccessful pregnancies were terminated through crude surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, with the remains disposed of in unmarked graves scattered throughout the property. Crawford's team uncovered the first of these burial sites when Deputy Samuel Clark noticed disturbed earth behind the barn, leading to the discovery of a mass grave containing the remains of 7 infants and 3 adult women. The county coroner's report, filed as Exhibit A during the trial, confirmed that the adult victims had died from complications related to childbirth, malnutrition, and untreated infections, while the infant remains showed evidence of deliberate suffocation or abandonment. This physical evidence provided irrefutable proof of the systematic murder that had accompanied Delilah's breeding operation. The search of the main farmhouse revealed additional evidence of the McKenna sons' captivity, including chains and shackles in their individual bedrooms, and medical records documenting their forced participation in their mother's crimes. Crawford's report describes finding journals written by the older sons, hidden beneath floorboards and containing desperate pleas for forgiveness from their victims and detailed accounts of their mother's threats and coercion. Thomas McKenna's diary, dated February 1899, describes his horror at being forced to participate in his mother's crimes and his growing determination to find a way to stop her reign of terror. The most revealing evidence of the sons' suffering came from medical examinations conducted immediately after their rescue, documenting years of physical and psychological abuse that had kept them under their mother's control. Dr. Margaret Foster's examination reports, preserved in the court files, describe malnutrition, untreated injuries, and signs of prolonged restraint that painted a picture of 5 young men who had been as much victims as perpetrators in their mother's criminal enterprise. Her psychiatric evaluation revealed severe trauma consistent with prolonged captivity and coercive control, providing crucial context for understanding how ordinary young men had been transformed into unwilling participants in unspeakable crimes. The breakthrough that revealed the full scope of Delilah's operation came when investigators discovered her master ledger, hidden in a secret compartment beneath the barn floor and containing a complete financial record of her human trafficking enterprise. This document, running to over 300 pages of meticulous bookkeeping, recorded the sale of 47 children over 8 years, generating profits that exceeded $20,000, a fortune by mountain standards. The ledger included buyer names, delivery locations, and payment schedules that would eventually lead to the arrest of dozens of accomplices throughout the region. Perhaps most chilling were the expansion plans Crawford found in Delilah's desk, detailed blueprints for enlarging the barn facility and acquiring additional victims to meet what she described as growing market demand for children of specific ethnic and physical characteristics. Her correspondence with potential investors revealed plans to franchise her operation to other isolated mountain locations, creating a network of breeding facilities that would have made her crimes a regional epidemic rather than an isolated atrocity. The evidence that finally triggered the McKenna sons' rebellion was discovered in Thomas McKenna's personal effects, a letter from his mother dated March 1, 1899, informing him that she had arranged for his youngest brother, 14-year-old Samuel, to begin contributing to the family mission upon his 15th birthday. This letter, written in Delilah's increasingly erratic handwriting, described her plans to use Samuel as breeding stock with new female captives she was preparing to acquire, crossing a line that even her psychologically broken older sons could not tolerate. Crawford's final report from the initial raid documents finding evidence of the sons' desperate planning in the weeks leading up to their revolt, including makeshift weapons hidden throughout the barn and detailed observations of their mother's daily routines that would allow them to overpower her when the moment came. Their handwritten plans, discovered in Thomas's bedding, revealed a coordinated effort to end their mother's reign of terror by using her own restraining devices against her, turning the instruments of their captivity into tools of justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally bring justice to the victims of Delilah McKenna's crimes, as her own sons prepared to risk everything to stop the monster their mother had become. The evidence Crawford's team gathered during that initial raid would prove instrumental in securing convictions, but the real breakthrough would come when the McKenna brothers found the courage to turn against the woman who had destroyed so many lives, including their own. The McKenna brothers' revolt began at 3:47 in the morning on April 2, 1900, when Thomas McKenna used a makeshift key carved from barnwood to unlock the chains that had bound him for over a decade. His detailed confession, recorded by Sheriff Crawford and later entered as evidence during the trial, describes months of careful planning as the 5 brothers coordinated their rebellion against the woman who had destroyed their lives and murdered countless innocents. The catalyst for their final desperation was Delilah's announcement that their youngest brother Samuel, now 15, would be forced to begin participating in the breeding program with 3 new female captives she had recently acquired. Thomas's written testimony reveals the brothers had been secretly communicating through a system of coded messages scratched into the barn walls, planning their uprising while maintaining the appearance of broken submission that had kept them alive for so many years. The physical evidence discovered by investigators supported every detail of their account, including hidden weapons fashioned from farm tools and detailed maps of their mother's daily routines that would allow them to strike when she was most vulnerable. Jacob McKenna's personal journal, found during the raid, describes their growing desperation as they realized that their mother's crimes were escalating and that intervention by outside authorities seemed increasingly unlikely. The brothers' plan required perfect timing and coordination, as Delilah maintained strict control over their movements and had installed a complex system of locks and alarms throughout the property to prevent escape attempts. Samuel's diary entries, written in the weeks leading up to the revolt, document his terror at the prospect of being forced into the breeding program and his admiration for his older brother's courage in planning what they all knew would likely be a suicide mission. The youngest brother's role was crucial, as his small size allowed him to access areas of the barn where the others could not go, enabling him to steal keys and disable locks in preparation for their coordinated attack. The rebellion commenced when Delilah entered the barn for her regular morning inspection of the captive women, carrying the ring of keys that controlled every aspect of life and death on the property. Thomas McKenna's confession describes the moment of reckoning when he and his brothers simultaneously broke free from their restraints and surrounded their mother, using chains and shackles from her own torture chamber to subdue her before she could reach the loaded shotgun she always carried. The brothers' coordinated attack succeeded because they had spent months studying her patterns and identifying the brief window of vulnerability when she would be distracted by examining her victims. The physical evidence discovered at the scene corroborated every aspect of the brothers' testimony, including the improvised weapons they had crafted and hidden throughout the barn in preparation for their revolt. Sheriff Crawford's crime scene report describes finding the wooden key Thomas had carved, scratched messages between the brothers outlining their plan, and makeshift restraints they had constructed from materials stolen over months of careful preparation. Most significantly, investigators found Delilah's own chains and shackles had been used to bind her, a symbolic act of justice that demonstrated the brothers' determination to use her own instruments of torture against her. The crucial evidence that supported the brothers' claim of acting in self-defense and defense of others came from Delilah's own documents, discovered in her possession when deputies arrived at the scene. Her handwritten orders for the day, found in her apron pocket, detailed plans to force Samuel into sexual slavery and execute 2 of the current female captives who had become non-productive due to injuries sustained during previous assaults. This document, written in Delilah's distinctive handwriting and dated the morning of the revolt, provided irrefutable proof that the brothers had acted to prevent imminent murder and sexual assault of multiple victims. The brothers' decision to chain their mother in the breeding barn rather than kill her outright proved crucial to establishing their credibility with authorities and the legal system. Jacob McKenna's statement explains that they deliberately chose to restrain Delilah using her own torture devices as both symbolic justice and practical necessity, ensuring she could not escape or destroy evidence before authorities arrived. Their choice to preserve her life, despite years of suffering at her hands, demonstrated a moral restraint that contrasted sharply with their mother's capacity for cold-blooded murder. The most damning evidence against Delilah emerged when the brothers led investigators to her private study, where she had maintained detailed records of every crime committed over more than a decade. Her personal safe, opened using keys taken during the revolt, contained financial records showing profits from selling 47 children, correspondence with buyers throughout the region, and medical records documenting the systematic rape and murder of 36 women. The brothers' testimony revealed that Delilah had forced them to witness her maintaining these records, using their knowledge of her crimes as psychological leverage to ensure their continued cooperation. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of the brothers' genuine victimization came from medical examinations conducted immediately after the revolt, revealing years of systematic physical and psychological abuse that had kept them under their mother's control. Dr. Margaret Foster's detailed reports submitted to the court documented malnutrition, untreated injuries, and signs of prolonged restraint that painted a clear picture of 5 young men who had been prisoners rather than willing participants in their mother's crimes. Her psychiatric evaluation concluded that the brothers exhibited symptoms consistent with prolonged captivity and severe trauma, supporting their claims of coercion and abuse. The testimony of the rescued captives provided additional confirmation of the brothers' status as victims rather than voluntary perpetrators of their mother's crimes. Mary Thompson, one of 3 women freed during the raid, testified that she had witnessed Delilah threatening to kill the brothers if they failed to comply with her orders, and that the men had repeatedly apologized and shown genuine remorse during their forced participation. Her sworn statement, preserved in the court records, describes Thomas McKenna weeping during one assault and begging his mother to stop the torture, only to be threatened with execution if he continued to resist. The physical evidence that sealed Delilah's fate came from her own hand, in the form of a detailed confession she had written as a form of insurance against potential betrayal by accomplices or authorities. Hidden in her bedroom safe and discovered during the post-revolt search, this document revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise and her complete lack of remorse for decades of murder and torture. Written in her distinctive handwriting and signed with her full name, the confession served as an unshakable foundation for prosecution and eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence or mental incapacity. The brothers' careful documentation of evidence during their captivity proved invaluable to establishing the timeline and scope of their mother's crimes. Hidden throughout their quarters, investigators discovered detailed records the brothers had kept of every victim, every crime, and every act of cruelty they had been forced to witness or participate in. Their secret journals, written in code and hidden beneath floorboards, provided corroborating testimony for dozens of murders and established a pattern of systematic criminal activity that spanned more than 15 years. Sheriff Crawford's final report on the revolt and subsequent investigation praised the McKenna brothers for their courage in ending their mother's reign of terror and their cooperation in ensuring that justice would be served for all victims. The evidence they provided led not only to Delilah's conviction, but also to the arrest and prosecution of 12 accomplices throughout the region, effectively dismantling an entire network of human trafficking and murder that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Their decision to risk everything to stop their mother's crimes exemplified the triumph of human decency over evil, even in the most desperate circumstances. The trial of Delilah McKenna commenced on September 4, 1901, in the Millbrook County Courthouse, where prosecutor Daniel Whitman presented what court records describe as the most comprehensive case of systematic murder and human trafficking in the state's history. The courtroom overflowed with spectators who had traveled from across the region to witness justice for crimes that had terrorized mountain communities for over a decade. Judge Harrison Matthews, in his opening remarks preserved in the trial transcript, warned the jury that they would hear testimony that challenges the very boundaries of human evil, but emphasized that the overwhelming physical evidence demanded unwavering commitment to truth and justice. The prosecution's case began with Sheriff Crawford's methodical presentation of evidence, starting with the mass graves discovered on the McKenna property and the detailed breeding records found in Delilah's possession. The court stenographer's transcript records gasps from the gallery as Crawford read aloud from Delilah's own handwriting clinical descriptions of forced breeding, infant murder, and the systematic disposal of women who became unproductive. Most damning was Delilah's personal ledger documenting the sale of 47 children, with prices ranging from $50 to $300 depending on what she termed breeding quality and physical characteristics. The testimony of the McKenna brothers provided the most compelling evidence of their mother's guilt, while simultaneously establishing their own status as victims rather than willing accomplices. Thomas McKenna's 3-day testimony, preserved in over 200 pages of court transcript, detailed years of psychological and physical torture that had kept him and his brothers under their mother's control. His account of being forced to participate in assaults while chained and threatened with death moved several jurors to tears, according to newspaper accounts from the Millbrook Herald that covered the trial extensively. The medical testimony presented by Dr. Margaret Foster proved crucial in establishing the systematic nature of Delilah's crimes and the genuine trauma suffered by her sons. Her examination reports entered as evidence documented malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological damage consistent with prolonged captivity and abuse among all 5 McKenna brothers. More significantly, her forensic analysis of the mass grave remains confirmed that multiple victims had died from complications related to forced childbirth, malnutrition, and deliberate violence, providing irrefutable proof of systematic murder spanning nearly 2 decades. The prosecution's most damaging evidence came from Delilah's own words, preserved in hundreds of pages of correspondence with buyers and detailed confessions she had maintained as insurance against potential betrayal by accomplices. Prosecutor Whitman's reading of these documents, recorded in the court transcript, revealed a woman who viewed human beings as livestock to be bred, managed, and disposed of for profit. Her clinical descriptions of torture methods, her calculations of breeding schedules, and her casual references to murder demonstrated a complete absence of human conscience that horrified even the most hardened courtroom observers. Delilah's defense, led by attorney Charles Morrison, attempted to argue temporary insanity and religious delusion, claiming that grief over her husband's death had driven her to madness. However, this strategy collapsed when the prosecution presented evidence of premeditation spanning over 15 years, including detailed business correspondence and expansion plans that demonstrated clear rational thinking and long-term criminal planning. Morrison's cross-examination of witnesses, recorded in the trial transcript, failed to shake any testimony and only served to reinforce the systematic nature of his client's crimes. The most chilling moment of the trial came when Delilah herself took the stand in her own defense, delivering what court reporters described as an unrepentant speech that sealed her fate with the jury. The stenographer's transcript preserves her exact words as she proclaimed that God had chosen her to create a pure bloodline, free from worldly corruption, and that every death and every act of violence had been divinely sanctioned for the greater good of humanity. Her complete lack of remorse, combined with her detailed knowledge of every crime, eliminated any possibility of jury sympathy or consideration of mental incapacity. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 36 counts of first-degree murder, 47 counts of human trafficking, and numerous charges related to kidnapping, sexual assault, and child endangerment. Judge Matthews, in his sentencing remarks preserved in the court record, described Delilah McKenna as a monster who perverted the sacred bond between mother and child to create suffering beyond human comprehension. He sentenced her to death by hanging to be carried out within 60 days, noting that her crimes warranted the ultimate penalty available under state law. The execution took place on December 15, 1901, at dawn in the Millbrook County Jail Yard, witnessed by Sheriff Crawford, the McKenna brothers, and families of identified victims. The official execution record, signed by all witnesses, documents Delilah's final words as an unrepentant declaration that God would vindicate her actions in the afterlife. Her death marked the end of a criminal enterprise that had claimed dozens of lives and traumatized an entire region, bringing closure to families who had spent years searching for missing daughters and sisters. The McKenna brothers, cleared of all charges due to overwhelming evidence of coercion and duress, received assistance from a regional charity to rebuild their lives outside the mountains that held so many traumatic memories. Court records from 1902 show that Thomas and Jacob McKenna relocated to California, where they worked as ranch hands and eventually married women who understood their tragic history. The younger brothers, Samuel, Matthew, and Luke, were placed with foster families in distant states, their new identities protected by court order to allow them opportunities for normal lives. The McKenna case led to significant changes in state law regarding human trafficking and child protection, with legislators citing the trial transcript as evidence of the need for stronger penalties and better investigation protocols. The complete court records, including evidence photographs and testimony transcripts, were preserved in the state archives as a historical warning about the capacity for evil that can flourish in isolation. Sheriff Crawford's final report recommended increased patrols in remote mountain communities and better communication networks to prevent similar crimes from operating undetected for extended periods. The legacy of justice in the McKenna case endures in the meticulous preservation of evidence and testimony that ensured no detail of Delilah's crimes would be forgotten or dismissed as folklore. The complete trial record stands as testimony to the courage of victims who survived to testify, the determination of investigators who refused to abandon their pursuit of truth, and the triumph of justice over evil in even the most horrific circumstances.